The empire of Zalax was not built on mercy. It was built on the grind of iron and the silence of the conquered. Hey friends, welcome. I'm Marcus. Another incredible gladiator story for you today. This isn't just a story about blood and sand, it's about the cost of a human soul. Let me know where you're watching from and please hit that subscribe button. Let's get started. At the heart of the capital stood the Iron Ring, a Colosseum where the sun felt like a spotlight on every sin committed within its walls. Today, the sand was prepared for a special execution. King Kalen, the Lion of the North, lay chained in the center of the arena. His armor was shattered, his legendary strength drained by weeks of starvation and torture. Above him stood General Varkas, the usurper who had stolen the throne in a night of fire and betrayal. People of Zalax. Varkas roared, his voice echoing off the high stone arches. Behold your fallen king. He promised you peace. But he gave you nothing but empty bellies. Today, the lion dies, and a new era of steel begins. The crowd, fueled by fear and the promise of free bread, let out a jagged cheer. Kalen struggled against his chains, his eyes searching the royal balcony. He wasn't looking for mercy. He was looking for her. Queen Lyra sat in the front row of the stands, surrounded by Varkas's black-clad guards. She was known as the Glass Queen, fragile, pale, and so soft-spoken she was often ignored in the halls of power. She was the woman Kalen had spent his life protecting. Varkas drew a massive, jagged executioner's blade. He walked toward the kneeling king. Any last words, lion? Or will you just bleed like a dog? Kalen spat blood onto the sand. The people will remember you as a shadow, Varkas. Shadows disappear when the light returns, then let's put out the light, Varkas sneered. He raised the heavy sword high above his head. The sun caught the edge of the steel, a blinding flash that signaled the end. The crowd went silent. The only sound was the wind whistling through the pillars. Clang. The sound wasn't the blade hitting a neck. It was the sound of a heavy iron gate being thrown open with desperate strength. Stop. The scream didn't come from a warrior. It didn't come from a rebel. It came from the royal stands. Queen Lyra had jumped from the 10-foot balcony, landing hard on the sand. She stumbled, her fine silk dress tearing as she scrambled to her feet. The guards were too stunned to move. The crowd gasped as the Glass Queen ran across the blood-soaked sand, throwing herself between the executioner and her husband. She stood in front of Kalen, her small frame barely covering him. She looked up at the towering General Varkas, her body trembling, but her eyes burning with a fire no one knew she possessed. Move, little girl, Varkas hissed, the tip of his sword inches from her throat. This is not a place for dolls. Lyra didn't flinch. She took a step forward, the blade pricking the skin of her neck. A single drop of blood ran down her collarbone. You want blood to satisfy the law. Lyra's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command that carried to the highest seats of the Colosseum. You want a death to seal your throne. She spread her arms wide, exposing her chest to the blade. Kill me instead, she shrieked. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a single person in the 50,000-seat arena breathed. The wind itself seemed to die down. The fragile queen, the woman who had lived in the shadows of the palace, was offering her life for the man who had been the world's shield. Kalen groaned, pulling at his chains. Lyra, no. Get back, I am the queen of Zalax, she shouted, turning her head to look at the stunned citizens. And a queen's first duty is to die for her king. If you want a sacrifice for your new era, Varkas, then take the one who actually holds the heart of this city. Varkas looked at the crowd. He saw the shift. The mockery was gone. In its place was a growing, terrifying awe. He saw commoners standing up, their faces pale. Varkas's hand shook. If he killed her now, he wouldn't be a conqueror, he would be a monster that even the darkest hearts would loathe. But if he didn't, he looked weak. You think your life is worth his? Varkas growled. I think my death will burn your throne to ashes, Lyra whispered, loud enough only for him to hear. Varkas pulled the sword back, his face twisting in rage. Fine. You want to die? I will give you a death they will never forget. But first, you will watch him suffer." He gestured to the pits. The ground began to vibrate. A low, guttural growl emerged from the darkness below. "The hounds of Zalax haven't eaten in a week, Lyra," Varkas laughed. "Let's see how much your heart is worth when they are tearing at your throat." Two massive, iron-scaled beasts emerged, their eyes glowing with unnatural hunger. They looked at the queen. They looked at the king. Lyra didn't run. She reached back and took Kaelin's hand, locking her fingers with his. "Don't look away," she whispered to her husband. The beasts lunged. The shadow of the first beast loomed over Lyra, its breath a foul stench of rot and iron. Just as the hound leaped, its massive jaws aimed for her throat, Lyra didn't scream. She didn't cower. She grabbed the heavy executioner's block beside her and threw her weight against it, tilting the massive timber. The hound's teeth slammed into the wood instead of her flesh, the impact sending a vibration through the sand. "Kaelin, the key!" Lyra shouted. As she struggled with the first beast, she had spotted it, the iron key to Kaelin's shackles hanging from Varkas's belt. Varkas, frozen in a moment of arrogant triumph, hadn't realized how close Lyra had moved to him during her speech. The second beast lunged. Lyra rolled through the sand, her fine silks tearing and staining red. As she spun, her hand darted out like a viper, snatching the key from the general's hip. Varkas roared in fury, swinging his jagged blade downward. Enough of this theater. The blade sliced through the air, but Lyra was no longer there. She had thrown herself onto Kaelin, shielding his body with her own as she fumbled with the lock on his heavy wrist irons. Click. The iron fell away. "The lion is awake," Kaelin growled, his voice a low vibration of impending doom. With the strength of a man who had found his reason to live, Kaelin surged upward. He didn't have a sword, but he had the heavy iron chain still wrapped around his other arm. As the first hound leaped again, Kaelin swung the chains like a flail, the heavy links shattering the beast's skull mid-air. The Colosseum erupted. The crowd was no longer silent, they were screaming Lyra's name. They saw the fragile queen, standing in the center of the carnage, her face splattered with blood, holding the key to their salvation. Varkas stepped back, his face pale. "Guards! Kill them both! Now!" But the guards didn't move. They looked at the queen, who stood tall against the sun, and then at the general who had tried to murder a woman in cold blood. The soldiers lowered their spears. "The queen has spoken," the captain of the guard shouted, his voice ringing across the arena. "And we serve the queen." Varkas turned to run, but he didn't get far. Kaelin, moving with the speed of a desert storm, intercepted him. He didn't use a blade. He used his bare hands, dragging the usurper to the center of the sand, right to the spot where the execution was supposed to happen. Kaelin looked at Lyra. He was covered in wounds, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but his eyes were full of a terrifying devotion. He waited for her word. Lyra walked toward them. The entire Colosseum held its breath. She looked down at Varkas, who was blubbering for mercy, the very thing he had denied her husband. She could have ordered his head removed. She could have fed him to the remaining hound. "No," Lyra said, her voice soft but echoing in the absolute silence. "Death is too quick for a man who tried to steal a kingdom's soul." She looked up at the thousands of citizens. "Strip him of his name," she commanded. "Strip him of his rank. Cast him into the salt mines. Let him live long enough to see the kingdom he tried to burn thrive under the light." The roar that followed was deafening. It wasn't the roar of a bloodthirsty mob, but the sound of a people reborn. Kaelin stood up and pulled Lyra into his arms. He was a giant of a man, a warrior king, but he leaned his forehead against hers as if she were the only thing keeping him upright. "You saved me," he whispered into her hair. "The glass queen, you didn't break." "Glass doesn't just break, Kaelin," she whispered back, her hand resting on his heart. "If you hit it hard enough, it becomes a weapon." As they walked out of the arena, hand in hand, the soldiers formed an arch of steel with their swords. The fragile queen had entered the Colosseum as a victim, but she walked out as the most powerful ruler Zalax had ever seen. The era of the lion was over. The era of the queen had begun.